Hi, welcome to the Times of Israel's Daily Briefing. It's Thursday, June 19th, and I'm Jessica Steinberg. I'm speaking today with U.S. Bureau Chief Jacob Magid. Hi, Jacob.
Hey, Jessica. Good to be with you again.
Glad we're here together. It is day 622 of the war. We started recording this about 50 minutes ago, and an Iranian missile attack spread sirens across Israel. That early morning rocket attack included a direct hit on Soroka Hospital in Beersheba and in Tel Aviv. And obviously, we'll keep on following what happened in those two spots. This morning, the IDF is telling Iranians to evacuate the area of the Arak reactor as it carries out strikes on Tehran. We'll discuss the U.S. role in all of this, as well as reactions in the U.S., including President Donald Trump's Iranian policy, the Republicans' split on Iran, the Democrats' interest in all of this, as well as what is happening with the ongoing aid situation in Gaza and hostage talks. Stay with us.
The law basically assumes that the enemy force you are fighting may not care about your civilians, but it certainly cares about its own civilians. What do we do in a reality where you're dealing with an enemy that the suffering of their civilian population is inherent to their war strategy? Now, that doesn't absolve us of our obligations. Hamas's inhumanity does not absolve us of the obligation for humanity. But the context that it creates, I think, is critical to the conversation, and it's very lacking.
I agree, but when democracies fight back against terror groups, they have to fight on two fronts. They have to both fight on the terms that have been laid out by the terror group, and the second thing you have to fight back is by preserving the norms of a democracy. We're forced to ask these moral questions about what we are and what we do, but based on an enemy that is not playing by the rules. But that's what we decide to be a part of by being the family of nations. And as Jews, we say, like every morning in our prayers, we say, Anachnu amcha b'nei britecha. We choose to be the people of God's covenant, meaning we tie ourselves to an aspiration of justice and righteousness.
Okay, so Jacob, rewind to where we were a little while ago. We were discussing the headline on our front page, yelling, "Nobody knows what I'm going to do." Trump's words on whether he will strike Iran, whether the U.S. will enter the fray. What are you hearing?
So I would say we're heading in the direction of a direct U.S. intervention if you take President Trump at his word. And we've seen quite a remarkable shift in the past week, but also if you just think about how he campaigned ahead of the election about being someone who wanted to avoid wars, end wars that had started, and being very critical of previous intervention in the Middle East. But in the past week, we've seen a real quick shift as once the attack was launched by Israel on overnight Thursday, Friday. The initial U.S. response was very careful, and you saw U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio basically distancing the U.S. from the Israeli attack and saying to Iran, if you choose to target U.S. personnel in the region, we will respond in kind. But other than that, we're not actively supporting Israel. That was not in the statement that Marco Rubio made. But then in the hours that followed, we saw a shift where Trump started to see the results of the attack and was very impressed. And I think that just the long list of successes, be it targeting Iranian nuclear sites or the regime members in the military, it clearly impressed Trump. And you saw him take to the phones, calling up all these different journalists and talking about how actually this was American weapons that helped pull this off, and that we should be getting some of the credit for what Israel was able to pull off. I think it was kind of what you saw. It reminded me of the October 7th response, which is that he was quite critical of, or not critical, but actually mocking Israel. He called Defense Minister Gallant at the time basically an idiot, I think is the word that he used. And I think it's part of this dynamic where Trump is very impressed by winners and wants nothing to do with losers. And once he saw that this attack went very well, he started being more willing to associate with it. Still, though, the initial response was, Iran still has a second chance, is what he called it, for a deal. And I believe it was on Saturday, he talked about that a war between Iran and Israel still should end. But then this was as a gradual shift from no involvement at all. We started seeing on Sunday that he talked about the U.S. could get involved By Tuesday, he was saying that actually we could maybe even kill Ali Khamenei, the Iranian supreme leader, if we wanted to. And by Wednesday, it was talk of unconditional surrender, which basically is signaling we're not really interested in diplomacy. Trump did say that we could maybe have a meeting at the White House, but it might be just too late for talks, is what he said. And clearly a shift, I think, to a point where he's talking about possibly supplying Israel with the B-2 bombers to help take out the Fordo nuclear facility that's buried deep underground on the side of a mountain, or actually being the U.S. being the one to carry out that strike that takes out the Fordo facility. He still is saying that he hasn't yet decided, but if you're following the rhetoric from the beginning of the week to now, we're definitely trending in the direction of U.S. involvement.
Surely feels that way. So that's what we're hearing from Trump. What are you hearing from the Republicans, the Democrats? There's a poll that we had running on our pages about Americans in general, but let's really look at the government and what politicians are saying, thinking, feeling.
I think more eyes are on the Republican Party because they're the party in power and control of both the House and the Senate. So, and I think the dynamics there are a lot more interesting and there's a lot more going on. Overall, I think you have a majority that backs President Trump. He's a sitting president. That's not very surprising. But what's interesting is the split amongst his hardcore group of supporters, the so-called MAGA movement that really brought him into power. You have that movement understandably uncomfortable with any sort of U.S. intervention. This is a movement that's very critical of U.S. intervention in the region, and I think Trump used that to campaign when he talked about the need to end wars, and it was a successful way to garner support from different parts of the Republican movement and even outside, and like the likes of Tulsi Gabbard, a former Democratic congresswoman who is now the head of the DNI, the intelligence agency. That was someone who several months ago was testifying before Congress that Iran had not made a decision yet to head towards a nuclear weapon, even though it was increasingly sending indications that it might want to. Trump was asked about that testimony on Tuesday and was very flippant in saying, I don't really care what she has to say, which was quite shocking. I think the administration then tried to do some damage control, saying that actually, no, the two are in lockstep. But she is a part of this movement, I think, the MAGA movement, that is not comfortable. And obviously, when she's a cabinet member now, she's going to be a little bit more careful of expressing that. But who's not being very careful of expressing discomfort are people like Tucker Carlson, the conservative commentator Steve Bannon, one of Trump's longtime supporters. Both of them are been very critical of any talk of U.S. intervention in Iran and concerned about a drawn-out war that they feel is not really the essence of America First, which is I think a movement that Trump has tried to spur and explain for what his foreign policy is all about. What was interesting was seeing a tweet that I think it was General Kellogg put out. He's Trump's Ukraine envoy, basically saying, look, America First is whatever Trump wants it to be. It's his movement. He can decide if it's America First to go and have a U.S. intervention in Iran, or to stay on the sidelines and not get involved. I think that's the attitude from some of his more hardcore supporters. But not everyone in the MAGA movement is feeling the same way, especially those who are outside of government, because Kellogg is another person in government. But Marjorie Taylor Greene, for example, another hardcore Trump supporter, is saying that this is just not something that we should be getting involved in. This is Israel's fight. And I think Trump is trying to deal with these mounting voices that are really quite uncomfortable with the idea of the U.S. striking Iran, given the history that I think a lot of people still remember from the situations in Iraq and Afghanistan. And I think what you had in an attempt at a little bit of damage control in the form of J.D. Vance putting out a tweet basically saying that Trump understands what's at stake and is not going to put U.S. troops in danger, but will be committed to preventing Iran to get a nuclear weapon. And this is what Trump is saying himself. He's saying that you can't be America first and also allow Iran to get a nuclear weapon. We all agree this is not a good thing, and we're trying to avoid that scenario. But if we have to fight, we will fight, is what Trump was saying on Wednesday, trying to calm some of that concern. But I think what they're dealing with is this but the response that I think some of the folks in Israel, but also Trump himself, are indicating that this is just going to be a simple one strike that the U.S. makes, and then we can
Right.
get out of the region.
Right.
But when you had actually Tim Sheehy, who's a freshman, I believe, congressman or senator from Montana, who's saying, look, wars are messy. Those thinking that this will be quick and done are simply kind of naive. And that's the kind of the voices that Trump's going to be hearing increasingly that are more critical. But he's also gaining some support from other parts of the party, the hawks in the party like Mark Levin and Sean Hannity, and also members of Congress like Lindsey Graham, who are calling on Trump to allow Israel to, or allow calling on Trump to finish the job that Israel has started. I mean, you had his ambassador in Israel, Mike Huckabee, basically saying that God has put you in this moment. He saved you from assassination in July in order for you to finish the job here. So it's not like he's getting hit on all sides. He does have a core group of supporters, and the majority of, again, Republicans, I do think will line up behind him. But he is dealing with a bit of pushback that I don't think he's used to, at least at this point in the presidency, where he's been quite popular amongst his base.
I think, just to sort of sum up this first half of the podcast, Iran is very far away for Americans. It's like Afghanistan. It is a conflict that takes place a very long way away, and obviously Americans are not feeling missile strikes, like Israelis are, like we are here. And so you want to keep conflicts away from your own zone. I mean, that's it seems to be that's a little bit of the reaction.
Right. And I think the way that Israeli officials are trying to combat that argument of saying, what do Americans have to do with what's happening in the Middle East, is to try to point out the assassination attempts that the Iranians are accused of trying to pull off against Trump. The fact that the missiles that they're trying to, the ballistic missiles that they're trying to develop can maybe reach cities like New York. But I'm not sure so far how successful those arguments have been in convincing the average American to get behind U.S. involvement. According to polls so far, the majority would rather see the U.S. stay out of this. One last thing I'd like to mention is if you look at other polling based off of how the Democrats view Israel, it's really a historic lows. I think a Quinnipiac poll from a couple months ago put it at between 20 to 30% of Democrats who sympathize with Israel. That's a pretty worrying number. The numbers amongst Republicans are different, and clearly there is more saliency and support amongst Republicans for Israel. But that feeling is split between a little bit by those in the MAGA camp who are increasingly uncomfortable with Israel. And I think the margin for error here, if U.S. intervenes and things don't go as smoothly as I think some in Israel are hoping, that it's just one quick strike and then we're done, but instead it actually ends up being a protracted conflict or U.S. personnel in the region being harmed, I do see a real risk to actually Republican support for Israel amongst those MAGA Republicans who will not blame Trump for things going wrong, but I see it more likely that they're blaming Israel and Netanyahu for dragging the U.S. into this war. So I do think, while of course Israel felt this was an existential issue that it needed to move forward, if it is going to be at the end of the day asking the U.S. to be the one to finish off the job in Fordo as opposed to doing it itself, and things go south, that's a major risk that could cost what we once saw as bipartisan support for Israel could turn to bipartisan opposition to the Jewish state.
Okay. All right. Thanks for that. We're going to take a quick break and very briefly look at what is happening with aid in Gaza and hostage talks. Stay with us.
What surprised you the most discovering about Jewish life in the United States?
I think it's the pride. I think I was envy of that pride. Just being proud, being a proud Jew. It's something that I never even contemplated. I was just an Israeli. I think the fact that, in Israel, we have all sort of sectors in society. You kind of grow up with your kind. I hate that. the fact that I don't know a lot about my Jewish life and I need to go abroad just to understand that. It's something so messed up and how we grew up here. It's just, I think, once it got political to be Jewish in Israel, it made me kind of push away from that. Once I got to LA, once I got just being with my daughters abroad, just understanding what we are, my heritage, where we come from, our story, our values. Took me a long time. Took me a long time to get there.
Okay, so 85 humanitarian aid trucks went into went into Gaza yesterday. What are we hearing about the distribution of that aid? Any kind of calming situation on that front?
Unfortunately not. I think we're seeing this every day, just the same scenario of reporting coming out of these either around Gaza humanitarian foundation distribution sites or even other sites that are being used by the UN to distribute aid have been flooded with people, and then also seen mass shooting or mass casualty incidents where you have the Gaza Health Ministry that's run by Hamas saying that we have dozens killed every day, but it's not just them. There's also the Red Cross saying that these numbers, that sometimes verifying or giving slightly different numbers to what the Hamas Health Ministry is saying. But nobody's denying that many people are being killed every day trying to pick up aid either at the GHF sites, that American Israeli-backed foundation, or in the case of Tuesday, where we had a really bloody incident involving IDF fire, where there were people that were crowding around a UN access route to try to pick up aid that they thought would be coming there. The IDF is admitting that it's opening fire in these incidents. And in the Tuesday scenario, we actually had the IDF in its statement express regret for any loss of life. It doesn't give too many specifics, but clearly there's an admission of some sort of responsibility by the IDF for opening fire. I think there was tank shells that were fired at the civilians who were trying to get aid in Khan Yunis. I think what is clear is that desperation is very high and that civilians are just trying to simply get to any place where they think aid might be delivered to, be it a GHF site or the other sites that the UN is using to try to distribute aid. And this is leading to just people crowding around areas, and real chaos that has led to people maybe straying off the access routes that the IDF says are approved, or because it's very late in the night, there's even more confusion. GHF says it's trying not to distribute food very late at night, according to a spokesperson I spoke with. But basically what's happening is that the people are so desperate for aid that they're showing up early to sites and getting there at 4 a.m. And then there's a decision made that we should just simply start to distribute because that will maybe allow for the crowds to disperse.
Sure.
Yes.
Sure.
But there's still a clear desperation that's not getting better. You're talking about 85 trucks that went in on Wednesday. That's a little bit above average from what we've seen for the past month or so since aid was resumed. But basically, what the UN is talking about needing is 300 trucks a day. So we're nowhere near that for the 2 million people to get. Obviously, there's progress in this GHF model and being able to feed so many people. But still, it feels like a little bit of a drop in the bucket when you see the amount of desperation that's still there. I think the UN will say that these incidents that are happening every day of people trying to get to the GHF sites and having to cross IDF lines to get there, and then coming under fire, prove that the GHF model is failing. On the other hand, the GHF will say that our model isn't failing, and then if the UN would just cooperate with us, we could establish additional sites in other places of Gaza, and that would allow for less chaos and more food getting into the mouths of Gazans. But in turn, the UN says we aren't able to simply cooperate with a militarized model of aid, and that's not really a solution either. And GHF will say in turn that, well, the UN their aid is not getting successfully distributed either. There's been lots of looting of the UN aid that's been going in, and there hasn't been enough publicity about that kind of looting that the UN is not able to prevent. And the UN says in response to that, well, actually, it's the same concept as the GHF. It's not looting. It's simply people are desperate and they're picking up food and we're allowing to do so. So you have a lot
Right.
of this back and forth of accusations between the two sides. But what I did see in my reporting over the past couple of days is there's an agreement between both the UN and GHF that simply there's not enough food going in right now, and that if more food came in, if you were flooding Gaza
Then
with
you wouldn't
aid,
have this. Right.
that you wouldn't have these desperate situations that we're seeing. And I think even both sides have actually been critical privately, definitely GHF more privately, of the decisions by the Israeli troops to open fire in these instances. And I did get a statement from the IDF saying that they're trying to improve the way that they're dealing with some of these chaotic scenes. But for now, we haven't really seen any actual application of lessons because these incidents are happening every day. Is it at the scale that Hamas is saying in terms of the numbers? Honestly, we don't really know. The Red Cross is a little bit more independent than the Gaza Health Ministry is, and they're giving sometimes the same, if not even higher numbers than what we're hearing. But we don't have reporters on the ground that are allowed to go in and report independently. So because Israel doesn't allow it, so it's really hard to understand what exactly is
What
happening
scale? Right.
and whether or not maybe there are areas that are actually getting more food than we know.
All right. Finally, there is a little bit of news on hostage talks as hostage families feel, more and more sort of pushed out of the conversation given the Iranian situation. But you have Egypt offering to host delegations from Israel and Hamas in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt, which ironically is also an exit route for people who are trying to get out of Israel right now. It's basically accessible over land. You don't have to fly there. So what is the likelihood of this actually taking place right now, given everything else that's going on?
So yeah, I wouldn't say too likely. I did speak with the U.S. official who was optimistic about this possibly happening at some point. But my understanding is that right now you have Egypt putting together this idea of having Sharm el-Sheikh be the host of the next round of talks because, as you mentioned, it's a way for Israeli officials who might have a hard time flying to Doha. They can simply drive, I guess, to Sharm el-Sheikh after crossing the border and holding these round of talks there. My understanding is Hamas is willing to participate, but the feeling in Israel right now, and Netanyahu hinted at this a couple days ago, is that the Israelis feel that right now the focus should be on Iran, and that if we can really turn the tide completely against Iran and just sideline and their nuclear program and their ballistic missile program where they're no longer able to support themselves, let alone proxies in the region, that will isolate Hamas even more and lead them to capitulate in the negotiations. But first, we need to give time for the Iran situation to play out over the next few days, possibly weeks, and only then can we turn to Gaza and the hostage issue. And I think that is understanding that for now seems to be accepted by Steve Witkoff, the U.S. Envoy to Middle East, who has not been pushing Israel, my understanding at least, speaking to Arab diplomats and another couple people familiar that say that there has not been a demand from the U.S. for Israel to send a delegation for now. Egypt is going to continue pushing, and I think that this concept of Sharm el-Sheikh is not going to go away, but I don't think in the immediate future that we're going to see another round of talks. I think Netanyahu wants to see the Iran situation play out, but even afterwards, speaking with one Arab diplomat who's been involved in these negotiations, arguing that this notion that now that Hamas is going to be more isolated because theoretically Israel defeats Iran will lead Hamas to say, oh, we're no longer going to demand a permanent ceasefire. We're going to accept more lenient terms. He thinks that's just not very realistic, that Hamas has not really budged from this position from the get-go. It wants to see a war end. And if Israel wants all the hostages back, the only way that's going to happen, Hamas says, is if the war ends. I don't know how much Iran dynamics will change that, but that's definitely the approach right now in Jerusalem, is to hope that they will.
And I'll just mention that hostage parents who I've been speaking to all week, they also agree with this idea of sort of combining any kind of ceasefire with Iran with the hostage situation. But again, remains to be seen. Okay, thank you, Jacob, for all of that today. It's taken us longer, and hopefully, given the siren situation and the missile attack situation, but hopefully we'll be able to close this out and move on with our days and you with your night. So thank you again for being on the Daily Briefing.
Thanks for having me, Jessica. Stay safe.
Thank you. And thanks to you for listening to the Times of Israel's Daily Briefing. Stay tuned for tomorrow's installment. This episode is produced by the Podwaves with the video edited by Tomas Gersh. We'll be back again tomorrow. And until then, take care, be well, stay safe.